Good morning. This hearing will now come to order. Today, the Interior Environment Subcommittee is conducting an oversight hearing into chronic wasting disease, which will be known properly for the rest of this committee hearing as CWD. In other agencies, it means something else, but here, one more time, it's chronic wasting disease, CWD. We will be hearing from two panels of experts. The first panel will focus on research that we know and what we have yet to learn. The second panel will focus on day-to-day management issues impacting hunting, food supply, and cultural activities. Each panel will have an opportunity for members to ask questions, but I do want to take a second to note that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge Program plays a critical role in addressing this disease on refuge land. We had requested someone from Fish and Wildlife Refuge Program on our second panel to discuss on a daily basis how refuges address CWD. In other words, we wanted someone from the field. Specifically, we wanted to hear how refuges prepare for the occurrence of this disease, what management changes they're making to prevent the transmission, their collaboration with state, federal, and tribal land managers and other nonprofit organizations. I'm disappointed to report, however, the department chose not to send anyone from Fish and Wildlife to speak on the direct work that they are doing on the ground. It's a missed opportunity that they're not here today. Chronic wasting disease is a fatal infectious disease that causes neurological damage in deer, elk, moose, and I'm going to even say reindeer, because we don't think of it here necessarily in, as I say, in Minnesota, our neck of the woods, but it's important to many of our international partners. We know no cure for this disease, which has been infected in North America in free-ranging and captive herds in 26 states and 3 Canadian provinces. We know the number of CWD-infected animals is growing and that this disease continues to spread and disrupt the balance needed to sustain healthy ecosystems. We also know it will take interior land management agencies such as the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, working in collaboration with other partners to combat the spread of CWD. As a member of the Agriculture Subcommittee, I will continue to work on this issue as well in the Agricultural Appropriations Bill. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services Wildlife Service plays an important role in controlling the disease in farmed deer and elk through regulations including fencing and testing to minimize the spread into wild populations. In my home state of Minnesota, we recently saw a disease leap more than 200 miles outside of a previous infected zone. A deer from a farm owner that had refused to destroy their infected captive deer. The disease spread to the local wild deer population. Once infected, deer are discovered in captive or wild populations. There are major concerns about how to dispose of the carcasses to avoid further spread of this disease. A team of experts from the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota has recommended several mitigation steps that we should be taking, including investing in greater CWD research, improving animal testing, management practices, and a big emphasis on diligent public health monitoring for the transmission to humans. Today's hearing provides a forum for us to learn about current research on this disease, its transmission, the challenges in developing detection tools, how stakeholders are working together to address disease and reduction infection rates. We will also learn about whether or not there's adequate, meaningful collaboration with tribal members in meaningful consultation. CWD doesn't just threaten our public health and the health of our wildlife. It also puts significant revenue streams at risk for our local communities and an important source of funding for state wildlife management and conservation activities. According to the 2016 National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation, 9.2 million people enjoy big game hunting, and that related hunting expenditures total $14.9 billion. And I know today's discussion will enlighten the committee as to whether CWD is impacting this important revenue stream. Before I introduce our first panel, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to include a statement for the record from Representative Jamie Becker Finn, a Minnesota state legislator, longtime deer hunter, who has been working at the state level along with many other state representatives and senators to stop the outbreak of CWD before it becomes widespread in Minnesota's white deer tail population. And that's what her letter has. Any objection?
None.
Thank you. So ordered. Now I would like to welcome our first panel who will discuss current research on this disease. William Hauser, Science Advisor to the Secretary of Interior and Chair of the Interior's Chronic Wasting Disease Group. Peter Larson, Assistant Professor at the Department of Veterinary and Biomedical Sciences at the University of Minnesota. And Paul Johansson, West Virginia Division of Natural Resources Wildlife Section Chief, Chair of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and Wildlife Health Committee, and Chair of the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study at the University of Georgia. And gentlemen, I could go on and list titles forever. We are very happy that you're here today. Thank you for joining us. But before I get started, I'd like to mention a very special colleague of these gentlemen working on this issue, and that's Dr. Tiffany Wolf from the University of Minnesota Veterinary College of Medicine. She's attending today. I want to express my sincere appreciation to Dr. Wolf for her efforts to coordinate with Minnesota's tribal nations on CWD. So before we hear your testimony, I'm going to yield to Ranking Member Joyce for any opening remarks he might have. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for holding this oversight hearing on chronic wasting disease in deer, elk, moose, and related species collectively known as cervids. I'd also like to thank our distinguished witnesses for the work they do and for being here today to testify about the latest developments and the highest priorities in moving forward. Having grown up hunting and fishing in Northeast Ohio, I understand the important roles for conservation, for connecting nature and to our heritage, and of course for food. I also understand the important role of deer farming as a means of helping landowners keep their land, of protecting our traditions, and of meeting the demand for fresh, healthy local venison. According to the North American Deer Farmers Association, which is located just outside of my district and whose president is a constituent of mine, deer farming is one of the fastest growing industries in rural America. It generates $7.9 billion for the economy and supports tens of thousands of jobs. So the threat of chronic wasting disease to North American deer, elk, and moose is a threat not only to the health of our natural ecosystems, but also to our way of life and our economy. The fact that the disease is now spread to 26 states and 6 countries, despite efforts to stop it, is alarming. It is, as we'll hear from our witnesses today, one of the most challenging wildlife management problems of our time. But it's not a new problem. 17 years ago, scientists and managers recognized the need for national coordination, and they published a plan for assisting states, federal agencies, and tribes in managing chronic wasting disease in wild and captive cervids. The plan included goal and action item and was followed for years by federal funding. Very curious to know what's been accomplished in that plan in the years since, and 17 years later, what still needs to be done. More important, though, I'd like to know what needs to be done so that 17 years from now, our successors aren't sitting here still wondering how to tackle this problem. That's why I want to again thank our chair for holding this important hearing and our witnesses for being here today to testify. I look forward to our discussion. I yield back.
Mr. Joyce, I'm going to date myself past 17 years on this issue. Started working on it in the mid-90s in the state of Minnesota. So with that, I'd like to welcome William Hauser, Science Advisor to the Secretary of Interior. So please, sir.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, Chairman McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on chronic wasting disease, or CWD. My name is Bill Werkheiser, and I'm the Science Advisor to the Secretary of the Interior. In that capacity, I serve as Chair of the Department's Chronic Wasting Disease Task Force. As you've stated in your opening statement, chronic wasting disease is a contagious, fatal disease that is becoming more prevalent in North American cervid populations, such as deer, elk, and moose. Unfortunately, there is no known treatment or cure for CWD. Prevention and limiting its spread is essential, and managing this disease will require a collaborative approach. CWD is caused by infectious prions, or misfolded proteins, that pass between animals or acquired from contaminated soil and plants. Animal-to-animal transmission is likely the initial driver for the disease transmission. The persistence of prions in the environment is expected to continue transmission risk for years to come. A high level of collaboration and communication between federal and state agencies, tribes, non-governmental organizations, and academia is needed to address the expanding presence of CWD. While states are the leaders for CWD, the USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service bring considerable expertise in wildlife disease research and wildlife management and work closely with the states to combat this disease. An important component of the department's support is the recently established Departmental CWD Task Force that works to better coordinate CWD response and research. As a science agency of DOI, USGS's mission is to provide non-advocacy scientific information to federal and non-federal resource managers. USGS scientists provide science to support CWD surveillance, develop tools for early detection and management, and better understand the biology of CWD. USGS maintains a constantly updated online map of CWD detections in captive and wild cervids in North America. The map data originate from many stakeholders and partners and is widely used by federal, state, and academic partners to monitor CWD spread. The gold standard for detecting this disease is a postmortem test of brain and lymph node tissues. USGS research, in collaboration with federal and state agencies, is focused on developing rapid and sensitive diagnostic tests to detect prion in blood, feces, and the environment. These tests will potentially provide alternative methods for antemortem testing and help managers detect infection early in the disease course. Future USGS research will concentrate on early detection and effective tools to support CWD management. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service supports state-led CWD management through the Wildlife Health Office, which provides technical support to wildlife refuges, funds CWD work on state and Fish and Wildlife Service lands, and provides training on CWD sample collection to state and federal personnel. The Wildlife Health Office also collects and tests samples for CWD and works with states to develop collaborative plans that include CWD management and monitoring strategies. States also receive funds from the Fish and Wildlife Service through the Pittman-Robertson Act, which are used to research and combat the disease. For example, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources currently uses over $2.3 million annually of their Pittman-Robertson funds to manage this disease. Currently, 49 national wildlife refuges and 24 waterfowl production areas are located in counties already infected by CWD. Future work will include communicating the effects of CWD on wildlife health, applying human dimensions research to disease management, enhancing the application of CWD research on Fish and Wildlife Service lands, and ensuring best management practices are applied throughout affected or at-risk national wildlife refuges. That concludes my testimony. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. And just so you know, for the record, your full testimony has been submitted. All of the testimony here, you couldn't do it in 5 minutes. Thank you so much. That was very enlightening. Dr. Larson.
Thank you. Chairwoman McCollum and Ranking Member Joyce, members of the Subcommittee on the Interior, Environment, and related agencies, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. It is an honor. I'm an assistant professor of molecular biology at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. My academic career has focused almost entirely on wildlife biology. I use emerging genomic technologies to investigate challenging biological questions pertaining to the genetics of wild mammals. With me here today is Dr. Tiffany Wolf, who is a veterinary epidemiologist with a strong background in wildlife health. Dr. Wolf and I are leading a team of epidemiologists, biologists, and engineers who have assembled with the common goal of assisting with the surveillance and management of chronic wasting disease, as well as spearheading CWD-related educational and outreach events. We're also working with the Minnesota Grand Portage Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa Tribe to establish a tribal CWD surveillance network consisting of 6 tribal nations across the state of Minnesota. Chronic wasting disease represents one of the most challenging wildlife diseases that we have ever faced. CWD is spreading throughout the United States, and all species of cervids can be impacted by this disease. This includes deer, elk, moose, reindeer, and caribou. CWD is 100% fatal, and the pathogenic agent is a nearly indestructible malformed prion protein. This CWD-causing prion is spread through bodily fluids of infected cervids, and it can persist in the environment for years. When a deer is exposed to CWD, a chain reaction begins to occur in the animal. The infectious prions slowly colonize the nervous system. They travel to the brain, where they begin to accumulate and kill neurons. It can take upwards of 2 years before infected animals die from CWD, and these animals can spread the infectious prions into the environment during that entire time. Emerging data suggests that plants, under certain conditions, can uptake the misfolded prions into their root systems and express them in their leaves, thus serving as a potential source for new infections through eating contaminated vegetation. We don't yet know the full extent of this phenomenon and its role in CWD transmission. Simply put, the biology of CWD is incredibly complex, and this complexity makes managing the spread of the disease extremely difficult. CWD has the potential to damage both regional and national economies in many ways. However, when considering the damage that CWD poses to our country, there is another critical issue at stake that deserves attention. This is the expansive heritage that unites humans with cervids. We have been interacting with deer in North America for thousands of years. For this reason, we are inherently connected with cervids. It is part of the lifeblood for all those that call North America home. CWD represents a devastating threat to that heritage. Our nation's cervids are under attack, and we must mobilize now to save them. Fighting the spread of the disease will require intense coordination among all stakeholders across federal, tribal, state, and community levels. We need to continue to support the excellent work by the USDA, USGS, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. We must also provide those tasked with managing CWD with new tools to combat the disease and to prevent CWD-contaminated meat from entering our food supply. There is no evidence to date that suggests humans can contract CWD by consuming contaminated venison. However, it's estimated that 15 to 20,000 CWD-positive animals are consumed in the U.S. annually. It is unknown whether or not this level of consumption poses a future risk to humans. The entry of CWD-positive meat into our food supply is largely the result of limited diagnostics. It is this area of research, diagnostic development, that our core research team at the University of Minnesota is working on. Our goal is to provide a more rapid, cost-effective CWD detection tool that will aid those on the ground who are monitoring the disease and that will also help to prevent CWD-positive meat from being consumed. In addition to scientific research efforts focused on CWD, we must also expand CWD-related educational and outreach efforts across the United States. We have initiated an educational campaign aimed at connecting with communities and stakeholders impacted by CWD across the state of Minnesota. There is a great deal of fear and misunderstanding about this disease, especially within CWD endemic regions. We need to engage the public and our stakeholders on the science of CWD and share with them all that we know about prion biology and about deer natural history. We are at a critical moment in the fight against CWD. We must do all that we can to protect the heritage that surrounds the cervids of North America. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective on this issue. I am happy to provide you with any additional information, and I look forward to further discussion on this important topic.
Thank you. Mr. Johansson.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Mr. Johansson, if you could move the mic just a little closer to you. Other than that, someone will come and do it while you're talking. So we'll take care of it now.
Thank you for the warning. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I need adult supervision, I'm sorry.
You're doing great.
Really appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today on behalf of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. My name is Paul Johansson, and I serve as Chief of the Wildlife Resources Section for the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. I also serve as Chair of the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study Steering Committee, and I chair the Fish and Wildlife Health Committee of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. CWD, as you've heard earlier today, is one of our most challenging threats to North American wildlife today. I know this firsthand because West Virginia is one of the 26 CWD positive states. CWD is a 100% fatal, transmissible, degenerative disease of deer, elk, and moose, and other species of the family Cervidae. More background on CWD is available in the Association's Best Management Practices document, and there are links to those provided in my written testimony. In the early 2000s, Congress directed significant federal assistance to the states for CWD. Since 2012, no federal funding for state surveillance, monitoring, or management of CWD and wild deer have been available. The growing economic burden of managing this disease has consequently fallen solely on the states. Impacts from CWD are now affecting other wildlife conservation efforts, the activities of federal agencies under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, and interests in the broader society. State Wildlife Agency expenditures on surveillance and monitoring jumped from $12.6 million to $13.3 million between 2017 and 2019 due to the increased demand for CWD testing, as encouraged by the states and also by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In 2019, state agencies reported an average increase of 32% in the number of animals tested between the current fiscal year and the next. Over the next 5 years, states anticipate spending over $84 million on surveillance and monitoring. State agencies also expend significant resources on the prevention and management of CWD, totaling over $13 million in the current fiscal year. All state expenditures on CWD are funds that would otherwise be spent on wildlife conservation activities. The funding to conduct surveillance, monitoring, prevention, and management for CWD comes from the very same sources that support broader wildlife habitat and conservation activities. Consequently, other species and wildlife conservation activities will be adversely affected by the continued spread and costs associated with CWD. I would like to thank you and the House of Representatives for passing FY 2020 appropriations that would provide federal funding for CWD research, surveillance, and monitoring. We appreciate your strong support, and we support adoption of these House provisions in FY 2020 Conference Committee negotiations. To address state agencies' research priorities for CWD more effectively, 46 researchers representing 25 different research entities formed the Cwd Research Consortium in September of this year, engaging multiple scientific disciplines and thematic areas. The consortium identified specific federal funding needs for targeted and strategic research projects within the divisions of U.S. Geological Survey as detailed in my written testimony. As Congress contemplates further appropriations, infrastructure support, and other legislation, we respectfully encourage consideration for CWD research, as well as crucial support for laboratory and facility upgrades and maintenance to address these CWD challenges. I am heartened to see the increased attention being paid to CWD by our colleagues at the Department of Interior. State agencies have primary management responsibility for surveillance, but there is much the department and its bureaus can and are doing to assist the states with CWD. Robust scientific expertise at U.S. Forest Service research and development could also be leveraged, and we would appreciate your assistance with reaching out to other members of the committee and working to integrate other federal agencies that can help with these CWD challenges.
Thank you.
As a, should I finish?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've got questions for you.
Well, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Well, Mr. Joyce and I are happy you're here, as well as Mr. Amati. First question. So thank you for mentioning the labs, Mr. Johansson. So I just want to point out that the U.S. Geological Survey invests in CWD at multiple science centers and cooperative research centers. And so the House bill has an increase of $5 million to renovate the BioSafe Level 3 diagnostic laboratories to convert new solid waste disposal systems to ensure investigations of outbreaks of wildlife disease can be done safely. So the USGS is working on that. I'd like maybe for you to comment on that, but I'm going to just kind of put everything together for you. The working group that you're working on, doing a lot of talking, doing a lot of identification. Can you maybe tell us a little more about how you think the interior bureaus are functioning in this working group? And right now, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, is not included. What you would think about including them? So kind of like, you know, your committee, what you're looking at, what needs to be done, and any funding suggestions you might have for state, federal government.
Thank you for the comments and those questions. So first of all, I'll address the facility issue at the National Wildlife Health Center. So we appreciate the amount of money in the mark for facility upgrades there. They are long overdue. And our feeling is that with those upgrades, that will lengthen the time that can be in effective research facilities for 5 to 10 years beyond. So thank you for that. As far as our CWD task force, Ranking Member, you mentioned the 2002 report. So our task force has taken that report, and the members on the task force include Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, National Park Service, BLM, and the way we've tried to structure that task force is to have a high-level management presence as well as a very highly technical presence from each bureau there. The task force, we're taking that 2002 report. We're also looking at the AFWA best management practices that were adopted recently, and we're kind of marrying those together for to address both management actions as well as research actions and where we need to go. So with there's been a high level of engagement from the bureaus in that effort, and a high level of interest from the secretary also. So the way we're approaching it is from the management perspective. Our goal is to support the states in their management actions. We don't want to imprint the federal government on top of the states. We want to work with the states and in collaboration with the states. On the research side, I think there's a high level of collaboration. We have modest investments in CWD throughout the department, and it's only through leveraging our resources with state and academic resources that we can accomplish work. And I think there's a high level of collaboration that goes on there. So we're looking forward to, we're writing our recommendations now. And again, we springboard off the 2002 report and then incorporate, or we're going to structure the recommendations to the secretary based on the AFWA best management practices.
And will your recommendations include, or maybe you're not done with them yet, including the Bureau of Indian Affairs?
Thank you for that. So yeah, we don't have formal representation of Indian Affairs, and it actually came up at our last meeting that we need to include Indian Affairs because of that collaboration. And in fact, one of our premier researchers in the USGS is the tribal liaison for the tribes in the Midwest part of the country. So we have some good working relationships, but we need to formalize those relationships and engage them in our committee work.
That would be great to formalize them. Mr. Joyce?
I'll initially defer to my colleague, Mr. Lemony.
With your permission, Madam Chair?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you to the
Please.
ranking member. Gentlemen, I struggled to get through sophomore biology in high school and went nowhere near a biology class at the college level, so none of these questions are trick. If I think I heard what your testimony was, in those states that it's not there, it just hasn't got there yet. It's not like somebody built an effective wall. It sounds to me like the history is, however it started, wherever it started, it's like it's kind of getting transferred, and when I hear from the chairwoman that there was a 200-mile jump or whatever, it's like the reason it's not, for instance, maybe in my state, is because it hasn't got there yet. It's just far enough away. Is that kind of accurate lay statement?
Well, it may not, if I could, it
Is
may
it
not
on?
be, sorry. It may simply be a factor that it hasn't been detected yet. It may actually be there. So there's a question, yeah, you're right. The disease may not be present, or it may simply have not been detected yet.
But the bottom line here is nobody's safe. It's not like, hey, they're doing something special in state XYZ, and therefore it isn't there, we're pretty sure. It's like, nobody's safe.
Yeah, I think.
Is that correct?
Well, I think we're, at one point, we talked about eradication of the disease. We don't think that's possible. It's controlling the spread of it. And so, I've heard the disease described as the 65-mile-an-hour disease, right? Because you put a carcass on a car, you transmit a live animal, you're potentially transmitting that disease
Okay.
at that rate.
Okay, and here's another biology all-star thing. Are antelope, are they hominid or cervid or sesame seed?
They're
or
certainly
whatever?
not. They're certainly not hominid.
So
Antelope.
some days I wish they were, but go ahead.
Antelope is it's one of the most amazing parts of the North American biodiversity. Antelope is a separate lineage
Okay.
that has evolved here. And so,
But we don't know if they're safe.
I mean, I think that's an open research question that we need to look at.
Bighorn sheep?
This is a prion disease. It's very complex, and there are other prion diseases that infect sheep, things like scrapie.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And then I guess the final thing, thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Ranking Member. To the extent we know, where did this start? Where did it come from?
I can speak a little
Has
bit
it
to
always
that.
been there, or what happened where?
Chairwoman McCollum and members of the committee. It's hypothesized that CWD originated from Colorado in the 1960s. And if you look at the latest maps from the USGS, you will see a region that is identified as essentially the epicenter. And you can see how the spread through these 26 states, how that's occurred since the mid to late 1960s over time. So that's
So
very
whatever's going
slowly-
on there kind of got its start in Colorado.
That's my understanding.
That's what you get for legalized marijuana. Oh, this is a different committee, I'm sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Being a geography part of the social studies, I just handed you a map showing the spread of the disease.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Joyce, I do have a question, but if you have one, please.
Thank you. I would just like to follow up on, and again, not making, trying to link it to anything, but the fact that in the West, you certainly have all the animals that are starving on the, especially the horses that we've seen, wild horses. Have we ever checked to see whether CWD is involved in the starvation of these horses?
Well, I would, so everything that we understand about CWD is that this disease primarily impacts cervids. I believe the USDA has provided some evidence that there's limited data showing that it does have potential to cross and impact other species. That includes distantly related primates and maybe some evidence in swine. But to my knowledge, I am personally not aware of any data suggesting that horses are at risk from this prion disease.
I'm told that states have initiated aggressive testing schedules after an initial positive confirmation of CWD, found many more positives under a more aggressive testing schedule. If that's the case, then do we really know how long CWD has existed and how big of a problem it is and whether it's actually spreading?
I think that is a crux of the question is, we have the maps that you've seen. Are those maps, do they represent the entirety of where CWD is? Or is it that we have gaps in surveillance so we don't know exactly where they are? And that's an open question. I will say that, and Paul probably has more information on this, but the surveillance efforts at the state level have really amped up in recent years. So, and that helps with that mapping function.
So, if I could,
Yes,
speaking
please.
from West Virginia's perspective alone, there's no question that that the CWD, the disease, is spreading and on the landscape as well as the prevalence level. The numbers of animals that are infected. It is an issue that continues to be very challenging. And from a national perspective, I think the evidence is pretty clear that we're looking for it more intensively, but it certainly appears to be spreading. And then that begs the question, what are the transmission routes for CWD? And part of it is just sort of natural movement of animals that may be infected either through natural migration or just natural movement, or the movement of cervid carcasses from hunter-harvested animals. And if you would note, we Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies developed a set of best management practices that address a number of those issues with regards to reducing risks associated with either movement of live animals or movement of carcasses. That's likely the transmission route, though.
Well, I believe the chairwoman brought it up in her opening statement, but if I heard you correctly, that the carcasses then decompose and become part of the plant life, which also helps spread this disease. What are we doing with carcasses?
Carcass disposal is one of the critical issues. To date, the most common method of disposal, I would say, would be landfilling. But as we learn more about the disease, the persistence of the disease, landfills are starting not to take carcasses. So the most effective means right now is incineration at very high temperatures. And those incinerators are pretty expensive.
As a follow-up, most state Fish and Wildlife agencies have also adopted specific regulations that relate to the movement of carcasses out of either a CWD, a known CWD area, or even across their state boundaries. And those regulations vary, of course, from state to state. But generally, they talk about only removing deboned meat, not moving any of the central nervous system tissues. It's all about trying to address the risks associated with moving those potentially infected animal parts to areas that are currently unaffected by or impacted by CWD.
I would also add, this issue of carcass management is huge, as if our collective efforts to develop a test that provides higher sensitivity, more fine-scale resolution, then it's very likely we will identify potentially many more positives. And so this issue of managing that stream is critical and requires great thought.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
To kind of follow on what Mr. Joyce was talking about, and just to have the discussion go a little deeper, one of the things that we need to figure out is testing. And back when this first became on my radar screen, when I was on the Natural Resources Committee on the House in Minnesota, was deer hunters were working with the DNR and with scientists about submitting carcasses and that for testing. And at the time, here we are moving these carcasses around for testing, kind of not what's going to, but it was a start, part of a discussion. So we still don't have a real-time test, and deer can be, and I'll just use deer to not list all the animals involved, but deer can be infected with it for a while before they show symptoms, whether they're in captivity, being farmed, or whether they're out in the wild. Maybe you can talk about mandatory testing, what we should be doing on that, what we should be doing for testing with farmed populations of deer, as well as what should we be doing with taking sample testing and working with, and it's going to be hunters and also Fish and Wildlife Service individuals and DNR, and just what we should be doing about that. And then Mr. Larson, kind of where we are on getting the science right. Where are we for doing real-time testing?
The question of testing is a huge question, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment on it. The infrastructure associated with, the capacity associated with testing facilities is really lacking from a nationwide perspective. The turnaround time for testing animals from hunter-harvested animals is very challenging for both the hunters and for the state Fish and Wildlife Agency. So that's an issue I think that is certainly worthy of consideration by the subcommittee. From a testing perspective, we generally view it. Our processes don't involve just hunter-harvested animals, although that's an important component. But we're also engaged in doing surveillance work across the landscape. And in West Virginia, we actually collect a lot of our surveillance animals from roadkills. It seems to be in fact, the very first positive CWD animal in West Virginia was detected in a roadkill. As far as mandatory testing, we don't have mandatory testing in West Virginia for all of our cervids. What we've tried to do is try to capitalize on the peak period when our hunters are afield, which is our traditional firearm gun season, and we put biological stations up where hunters can come in and our staff can pull the retropharyngeal lymph nodes and do the appropriate testing. But it's a huge issue, and it's an issue that really needs some attention. I will also say, just conclude by saying that the BMPs, the best management practices that I referenced, that are in the written testimony, or links to it are in a written testimony, provide additional information as to what we believe are the best protocols, the best procedures in place for providing guidance to state fish and wildlife agencies on that issue of testing hunter-harvested animals.
Just quickly, the testing is an area of active research for both USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service. The development of a rapid test that can be used right now, post-mortem or environmental, is really a high priority. We are a long way from a live animal test, which would be great, but that's way down the road. As Paul mentioned, the main problem is if you're a hunter and you get your animal tested, it could be weeks before you get the results back, and many hunters don't have that kind of time to let them meet,
Right.
sit around, and that's an issue.
So with respect to the currently available tests, the gold standard test is an antibody-based test known as IHC, immunohistochemistry. This was a technique that was developed many, many years ago, decades ago, in the 50s and 60s. That's our current gold standard, and it takes a high level of expertise. It takes time, and there's a question whether or not how sensitive that test is if we're failing to detect low levels of infection. There's exciting developments on the diagnostic front. Within the last 10 years, there's been the release of sort of Prion amplification methods known as PMCA and RT-QuIC are the acronyms. These methods actually leverage the biology of how prions spread, and you can leverage that biology, and you can create an environment to detect prions in samples that include blood, soil, feces. They can detect very small amounts of prions in those samples. And there's great interest in RT-QuIC. This was a topic of conversation at the recent multi-state CWD meeting in September. This RT-QuIC method, those teams that are focused on developing a next-gen diagnostic, many of those teams, including ours, are focusing on this recent diagnostic tool to try to improve that, to increase sensitivity. And so there's a lot of excitement about the new diagnostic tests that were released within the last few years. Now the issue is taking those and bringing them into this sort of next-generation format. And that's something that I'm very excited about, because I know that we have engineers at the University of Minnesota, we have collaborators at other universities that know how to leverage recently developed genomics tools to get us to a more rapid and sensitive test. And so this is an area of research that's very exciting, it's very dynamic, and I think that not just from our team, but teams across the US, you're gonna see progress, rapid progress on that in the coming years.
I have two more questions, but I want to give you a chance.
Since we've established that it's the decomposition gets it into the food chain, and obviously they're being hunted, has there been any known instances of CWD in humans?
There's no known instances in humans. That species barrier appears to be intact, but the CDC recommends you don't consume any CWD-infected meats.
I would follow on that. There's no evidence of it crossing humans, but there's concern. And the reason for the concern is that we don't have a good understanding of the variation, the strain variation of these infectious prions across all populations of cervids. There's variation there. And it could be that some combination, some form of that CWD prion in one particular population could pose a risk for human transmission, but that's something that we do not understand. This is something I spoke to in my written testimony, is that we need to improve the genetic resources from across the populations of all cervids in North America. That's going to help us better understand potential future risk to humans, but there is no evidence at this point that is crossed over.
Thank you. You bet.
So, Mr. Johansson, you touched on this, and I'm sure the working groups talked about this a lot. And this has been a concern, I know, for many states that enjoy, in fact, we have it in our Minnesota State Constitution, the right to hunt and fish. So we're very much aware of what happens when, whether it's CWD, Asian carp, and that, the effect it can have on people wanting to hand to the next generation these wonderful opportunities of being out in nature. And, you know, licensing going down and how that affects, you said, so many other integral parts of it. If you could, maybe, gentlemen, the two of you, I have a question for you, Mr. Larson, after they're done. Kind of comment on, you know, how we have to engage the public on this in a way that doesn't curtail them from going ahead and recreating in the outdoors, but make them active participants in solving this problem.
Yeah, thank you. I would characterize it that the single largest or greatest conservation challenge we face right now as state fish and wildlife agencies, quite frankly, is it certainly ranks right up there is chronic wasting disease, and there's not only the biological side of the issue, which we've talked about, but it's also the human dimension side. It's that tradition of hunting that is equally strong, I assure you, in West Virginia as it is in Minnesota, and we need to keep hunters are probably our most important tool that we can use to manage this disease in terms of regulating deer population sizes, providing us with samples for determining prevalence and distribution of the disease. We need to keep hunters actively engaged in the sport of hunting, not only for the cultural aspect, but also for helping us manage this. It is absolutely incumbent upon state fish and wildlife agencies to develop and improve their human dimension capacity so they can properly deliver the appropriate message to our hunters to make sure that they're part of helping us with the solution or helping us resolve or address the issues of CWD. I can't underestimate the value of that, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge for state fish and wildlife agencies across the country. And if there are two primary areas where I think we need to focus attention on, one is developing capacity for these laboratory testing and get the test results done more quickly, but also to make sure that we're addressing this issue of our hunters and making sure that we answer their questions openly and honestly and allow them to be part of the solution. And quite frankly, we need help in that capacity.
Sir?
I couldn't agree more. The top two research areas we identified within the task force is just what Paul said, the testing and then the human dimension research and the use of social sciences to help that, you know, what is the role of the hunter and the human in acceptance of the message, being a willing partner, being a protagonist rather than turning them off and making them go away. So that's going to be one of our prime recommendations, is improving that human dimension side so that we can engage the hunters in a productive way.
Dr. Larson, you touched on this a little bit in your conversation with Mr. Joyce about the fact that it appears, we can't say beyond a reasonable doubt, but it appears that there is no crossover from humans from consuming this deer meat, elk meat. But there's another component where your research and putting dollars into understanding these prions, and it was in your written testimony, I want to flush this out a little bit, can have a multiplying effect on understanding other prion diseases that are in our population right now: Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS. And as we know, when we put a person on the moon, the first man on the moon, we unlocked a whole lot of things that had all kinds of great implications for science and for technology. If you would just take a second and just talk about how important doing this full, robust genome research is.
Chairman McCollum, thank you so much for pointing this out. This is an area of research that I'm very, very excited about. Prior to joining the University of Minnesota, I was a postdoc and research scientist at Duke University for 6 years, and one of my main projects there was on Alzheimer's disease. What's very fascinating about all neurodegenerative diseases is that there's this common thread that unites them. These are protein misfolding diseases. In Alzheimer's disease, you have things like amyloid forming in the brain. In Parkinson's, you have Parkin misfolding. And in ALS, you also have protein misfolding. So CWD, BSE, mad cow disease, scrapie, these are prion diseases. They're all based on protein misfolding. That aspect that unites these neurodegenerative conditions is incredibly important. I think it is ripe for discovery. I think that the science of protein misfolding with respect to neurodegenerative disease is very young, and I think that we need to devote a lot of resources into this area of research. With respect to CWD, understanding prion biology, understanding how that molecule misfolds, that a deeper understanding of that could yield some fantastic insights into our understanding of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. Improving the genomic resources for cervids will help provide scientists, molecular biologists, genomicists like myself and others with a set of tools, if you will, many options. And in my written testimony, I said that it was very important that we develop high-quality genome assemblies for each cervid species in North America and likely from multiple populations. With respect to advancing our understanding of these protein misfolding diseases, having access to these genomic resources is amazing, and that will open up many, many doors for downstream research activities. So I would stress that any funding that goes into developing the genetic resources of cervids, of CWD, understanding how this, a deeper understanding of that prion misfolding, how that occurs, how it's transmitted, that will yield insights into other neurodegenerative conditions in humans. Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony and for giving us some ideas on how we can best collaborate with partnerships, state, local, and interagency here in the federal government to address this disease, as well as working with health researchers. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Oh,
Okay, so
we're back on the record here.
real quick, back on the record. Real quick,
good,
defining
good,
misfolding.
Good question.
Okay.
Good question.
So, okay,
Mr. Joyce, please restate your question so people can hear it.
For us non-biologists, could you define misfolding
I'm happy to do that. So I have
in
to.
regular folk talk?
Okay, the question is, could you please define misfolding? I have an analogy, and I have to admit that this is something that my wife developed as part. She's a fantastic educator, and I was struggling with how to explain this to the general public. And she took a slinky, just a normal slinky. Think of a slinky and how it functions and how it moves. Think of that as a normal prion protein. If you take that slinky and you curl it up and you form it into this three-dimensional mess, that ball, that's no longer functional. It doesn't work like a normal slinky does, right? That's misfolding. You're changing that three-dimensional shape from the normal slinky into this glob mess that's sticky. That is the abnormal form. And that's the daisy chain that's happening in these animals, and that's how prions, that's how we've been describing this misfolding.
That's a very good way to describe it, because I don't think any of us will forget that description.
Absolutely.
I can hear you on the floor with your colleagues right now. Thank you again,
you.
gentlemen. You're going to be Dr. Science with everybody, Mr. Joyce. While we're preparing the table here, our next panel that will be coming up to discuss, and it'll be the day-to-day management of hunting and implications from this disease, will be Travis Bartnick from Wildlife. I'm just waiting for things to kind of calm down here. Not calm down. People are having great discussions, and I don't want people to miss your introduction. So we'd like to, at this time, welcome Travis Bartnick, wildlife biologist. Travis Bartnick, wildlife biologist, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Whit Fosberg, President and CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And again, gentlemen, it's with great sadness that I am going to note the absence of U.S. Fish Wildlife Service, who I know you work with, because we wanted to have the people out in the field who we could interact and ask technical questions to. They're not here today, so we thank you for being here. And we'll start with you, Mr. Bartnick.
Well, good morning, Chairwoman McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce. Thank you for inviting me to speak about chronic wasting disease on behalf of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLFWC. My name is Travis Bartnick. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I serve as the lead on CWD-related issues for GLFWC. Just a little bit about the organization or the agency that I work for. GLFWC provides natural resource management expertise, conservation enforcement, legal and policy analysis, and public information services in support of the exercise of the tribe's off-reservation treaty rights in the treaty-ceded territories. So we strive to ensure that all ceded territory natural resources are abundant and healthy. GLFWC is involved in this issue because our mission is to assist our 11 Ojibwe member tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan in implementing the hunting, fishing, and gathering rights that they reserved in treaties with the United States. And CWD poses a serious threat to that mission. When a child is born into a tribal community, one of the important things that happens is a ceremony where that child receives his or her name. 4 foods must be present at the feast: corn, berries, wild rice, and venison, each of which is an integral part of that ceremony. These 4 foods are prepared for ceremonial feasts throughout the lives of tribal members. CWD poses a serious threat to one of these culturally important foods, namely venison. The Ojibwe engage in the harvest of several species of the Cervidae family, moose, deer, and elk. And these animals are harvested to support the health of Ojibwe communities, with venison feeding families, providing for subsistence needs, and supporting cultural practices. CWD and its management, or lack of management, is complex, and its presence within the cervid populations and on the landscape represents a threat to the lifeways of the Ojibwe people. Since 2002, detections and prevalence rates of CWD in the western Great Lakes states have been increasing. CWD has been relatively absent from the treaty-ceded territories, and the tribes would like it to remain that way. However, within the last 2 years, 4 wild CWD-infected deer have been detected within the Wisconsin ceded territories, where tribal members exercise their off-reservation treaty rights. In addition, 5 captive cervid facilities have had animals test positive for CWD in the Wisconsin ceded territories, and 4 of those 5 facilities continue to operate. Currently, GLFWC is working in several areas on CWD, providing technical assistance to tribal governments to develop strategies to limit the spread of CWD, providing information about CWD testing and facilitating that testing, coordinating with tribal natural resource departments, health departments, and state and federal agencies on CWD management, keeping up to date on the latest research, and raising awareness of CWD within tribal communities, especially among hunters. Of the many management issues that have been touched on already today associated with this disease, one is the need for standards governing carcass movement and the transportation of live cervids. Experts have suggested that moving live animals and transporting diseased carcasses from the point of kill are the most likely ways that humans are spreading this disease. In addition, hunters, meat processors, captive cervid facilities, they need opportunities and requirements to appropriately dispose of deer carcass waste. This would require investments in planning and logistics to effectively coordinate among individuals producing carcass waste, natural resource agencies, and waste haulers and landfill operators. We also need improved testing opportunities, as has been discussed so far today. So the development of a faster, more efficient CWD test that could be conducted in the field would be extremely beneficial. The concerns of our member tribes have been growing as CWD continues to spread across the landscape. These concerns are especially significant because CWD is likely to disproportionately impact the livelihoods of the Ojibwe people and may lead to a perception that this healthy and wholesome food source and the culture of hunting itself is a risky endeavor. The United States government has treaty obligations that stem from its status as one of the treaty signatories. The U.S. guaranteed to the tribes the right to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded lands. Fulfilling this obligation means supporting much-needed research on CWD, giving tribal, state, and federal agencies the resources that they need to develop and implement proactive management actions to prevent this disease from spreading further. So I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Fosberg?
Thank you, Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, and the committee for holding this hearing today on chronic wasting disease and the threat that it poses to hunting and wildlife conservation in America and the steps that Congress can take to address the spread of the disease. I'm Whit Fosberg. I'm the president and CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, an organization created to unite and amplify the voice of sportsmen and women in federal policy impacting conservation, habitat, and access. We have about 60 nonprofit partner organizations, including the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and about 100,000 individual members and supporters. Very simply, CWD is the greatest threat facing the future of hunting in America today. Key facts have been mentioned but are worth noting. It's 100% fatal, and there is no vaccine or cure. From when it started, it was first found in 1967 in Colorado. It spread to 26 states today. CWD spreads very slowly in the wild. It can spread very quickly when live or dead animals are moved by people. Once CWD infects an area, it's almost impossible to eradicate. And while CWD has never been documented from jumping from deer to humans, the CDC does recommend against eating any CWD-positive meat. The prions that cause CWD can be taken up in plant matter, including alfalfa and corn. Norway, which is trying to control an outbreak of CWD in reindeer, now bans the importation of any agricultural products from CWD-positive areas. You can't cook your way out of CWD. The prions remain viable to about 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. And smart and aggressive management can greatly slow the spread of CWD and keep it at background levels. Deer hunting in America is a $40 billion a year business. 80% of America's 11 million hunters consider themselves deer hunters. And the excise taxes that hunters pay on guns, ammunition, archery equipment, along with the licenses and tags that they buy, fund conservation in America, making up a large percentage of the budgets of the state fish and game agencies, which have primary responsibility for managing fish and wildlife. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, participation in hunting has been declining from about 13 million people to 11 million people in the last decade. One bright spot in those numbers has been the growth in the field-to-table movement, people who hunt to provide lean, organic, locally sourced protein for their friends and family. If people become wary of eating deer or elk, this area of growth in participation could fall away entirely, and conservation will be the biggest loser. Fewer hunters means less funding for conservation, including conservation of a variety of non-game species that benefit from the current model of conservation funding. Hunters and non-hunters both stand to lose if CWD continues to spread. Until 2012, Congress appropriated about $15 million to the state fish and wildlife agencies to track and test for CWD. At that time, there were 21 states that had CWD. Since that funding was eliminated, CWD has now spread to 26 states. Now the states that are in the front lines of CWD management have to siphon off resources from other sources of funding to fund their programs, or I simply stop looking for the disease. To its credit, Congress seems to recognize the threat that CWD poses to hunting, agriculture, and even human health. In the FY20 Agricultural Appropriations Bill, $15 million is made available to support CWD surveillance and testing by state wildlife agencies. Surveillance and testing is the key to controlling CWD. By knowing where it is, states can take the management actions necessary to contain the disease. In addition, with more laboratory capacity, it makes it much easier for hunters to have their deer tested for the disease. So I urge the committee to support that funding in the Ag Appropriations Bill in the conference with the Senate, which seems to be a little slower in recognizing the severity of the disease. This subcommittee has also stepped up to address CWD. Your FY20 Interior Environment Appropriations Bill
prioritize CWD research and designates funding for the National Academy of Sciences study in partnership with USGS and APHIS to explore the current body of research, identify and prioritize future research, and evaluate current management standards and regulations. Further, your bill allocates an additional $1.72 million to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to research CWD and improve testing methods. Both the NAS study and the expanded research funding are critical priorities and need to be maintained in conference. In closing, thank you for your leadership that you have shown to address the spread of CWD, and I encourage you to advocate for both the funding levels set in the final versions of the House Interior, Environment, and the House Agricultural Appropriations bills. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Joyce, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. As we heard from the last panel, testing takes 2 to 3 weeks. You make the point about farm to table. We certainly know that folks are harvesting deer in the woods and skinning to what they need to do, bringing that meat home. What is the ideal way to monitor and be able to test that in a more time-efficient manner?
Yeah, no, I think that the key is, giving the states more capacity to do that testing. Because right now, whether a hunter, gives the head or the lymph nodes to a testing facility in that state, it's very likely that testing facility is not convenient, and it's going to take a long time, weeks, to get that, meat tested and sent back to you. In the meantime, you've got a deer, sitting in your refrigerator, in your freezer, and you have to figure out what to do with it. I mean, there are a couple of steps that, hunters themselves can take. It was mentioned that it's, if you have the opportunity, just bone out that deer in the woods and leave that most infectious part of the animal if it has CWD out there. Because that does not, we already know by definition, when you shoot an animal in the woods, that CWD is present in that area if that CWD is there. If you just leave the bones, the head, that carcass out there, other than the lymph nodes, for example, then you're containing the spread of that disease. If you drive it back home and throw it into the dumpster when the Friday garbage pickup comes, you're spreading that disease. So I think there are things we can do, but I think the key thing is giving the states more resources to do testing and surveillance.
Is there an ideal way to monitor this hunter? The other thing is you're going to have, at least around us, is a lot of roadkill. And that if it's being spread that way, I mean, testing roadkill may be a more...
Well, I think you're seeing the states actually do that quite a bit right now, and that's how they've identified sort of the fringe areas where CWD comes present, because that is, first of all, it's not just during the hunting season, and that's 365 days a year. And it allows them to test areas that are outside those zones and where they may not be doing any testing. So I think monitoring roadkill is critical as well. But again, it requires the resources from the states. And right now, what they're doing is that Pittman-Robertson dollars, the tag license dollars that are getting, which really should be for conservation, for monitoring poaching, things like that, are now being siphoned away to fund this sort of testing. And if we can go back to what Congress was doing before in 2011, 2012, and previously, it was about $15 million out to the states. If we can get that reestablished, which the House bill does, then that goes a long way, to helping the states have that capacity they need to do that testing.
Well, certainly our chairwoman has been making sure that the funding is there. We just want to make sure it's being applied appropriately in a most efficient manner to make sure that we stop the spread of this as soon as
I think that's
possible.
a great point. And some of the previous witnesses mentioned the best management practices that the Association of State Fish and Wildlife Agencies produced, and that really provides a roadmap to how those funds can be used in an effective way to slow the spread of the disease.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bartnick, I want to ask a couple of questions of the tribal organizations and how they've been working with. In Minnesota, we have 11 tribes, and as you pointed out, they have the right to hunt, gather, and fish. Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin make the big part of GWIFLEC. In 2004, the commission looked at the Fish and Wildlife Great Lakes, GWIFLEC, looked at a way to prevent the spread of CWD into unaffected areas and the transfer of animals on or off game farms. And so one of the questions I'd like you to spend a little time is, has there been enough consulting? Have people listened to your concerns on this, the alarm that you have raised? And then what restrictions are being put in place that actually impact tribal members? If I'm understanding some of what I read right, unless a tribal member in an area does the dressing on site, there's issues about moving deer around, but I don't hear about it outside of the tribal area. So I'm wondering if I understand that correctly, and if so, it's kind of I'm just going to say it, kind of a double standard that I'm hearing. And then lastly, if you touched on how it impacts cultural activities, but one of the things that we've been working with tribes, and tribes have been very active in, is the reintroduction of gray wolves in the Great Lakes area. And have tribal nations, with your work that you do, have you seen that as a way to kind of keep things check and balance in wild populations, to keep here? Because we think the size of the herd number may or may not affect the spread of this disease. We don't know that for a fact yet, but if it is a factor, the gray wolf being reintroduced. I know I gave you quite a bit, so, but it's not often we have someone here, and we've kind of found out, I think, through the earlier testimony, that the tribes haven't been consulted in the way that they're going to be in the future.
All right, well, yes, there's a lot to go on there. Excuse me if I don't follow all of the questions in the order that you asked them. But the first one had to do with whether there's effective or efficient or appropriate level of consultation. And I think that there's always room for improvement there. And it's a message that, I've been trying to participate in CWD working groups at the state level or regional level, and it's something that I've brought up several times. I actually had a presentation at a Wildlife Society meeting where I talked about this subject in particular, about having effective forms of communication between local, state, federal agencies, and tribal nations. And I think, like I said, there's always room for improvement there. One thing that, really makes things difficult is when we hear about a new detection of chronic wasting disease through on the local radio or in the newspaper, before we hear it from the state agency that in their response plan might say that the first thing they're going to do is contact the local tribes, So it kind of feels like, there's maybe not enough effective and fast communication with the tribes in that respect. And not in all cases, but in some cases. I've been with the commission for just a few years now, so in my experience, I've definitely noticed that sometimes we're not always informed of some of these issues when we would hope to be, so that we can better inform all of the tribal nations, and they can act, however they want when they hear this kind of news, and we can get together and try to come up with a game plan for a response to that kind of news and that kind of thing. So I think that is definitely an area where we could use some improvement, just in that in the government-to-government consultation. Your second question had to do with certain restrictions, and I'm not sure I quite followed exactly what your point was.
I'll follow through with
Okay.
that in a written one. It has to do with the Voight Intertribal Task Force approving chronic wasting disease management areas after wild deer were tested
Oh,
positive.
yes. I can elaborate on that. So about 3 years ago, we formed an intertribal CWD working group, and that consisted of tribal natural resources staff, and then also some of these Voight Intertribal Task Force representatives, so representatives from each of the tribal communities that we work with. And the purpose of that was to have a group that would focus solely on CWD and its impacts within the ceded territories. And because we weren't seeing enough what we thought enough actions taken by the state in response to some of these recent outbreaks or detections of this disease on the landscape. The tribes took it upon themselves to come up with these recommendations, which are actually more restrictive than what a state hunter would have. So designated an area centered around where these new detections have been found on the landscape, and tribal members, there's carcass transportation restrictions, so they can't remove the animal, parts of the animal from that management area. And the main intent of this is to do everything possible to prevent further spread of the disease from where it's being found. And we certainly don't want them bringing it back to their tribal communities and then disposing of the carcass somewhere on the landscape within their reservation, and then that leading to, further spread of the disease. So they took it upon themselves. So, there are certain restrictions associated with it. Beyond carcass transport, they have to do a remote registration. So they're not bringing it back to their community to register at a tribal registration station. And so, that was an action that the tribes took upon themselves to try to do this in a right way, in the right way that was discussed among tribal representatives and tribal elders. And it's, like I said, it's a step above and beyond what the states have been doing in that particular part of the ceded territories. We'd like to see more action taken, especially with just last week we heard about the 4th detection in this very localized area where 2 of our member tribes regularly hunt deer. So
you've chosen a higher standard
I
voluntarily?
believe so, yeah.
So it's a double standard. You've chosen the higher standard, and the states may or may not follow. Okay. You comment on the gray wolf, and if there's been any discussion within the tribes about having that being part of a resource management tool in dealing with this disease?
Definitely. I think, maintaining and improving predator populations. I think that there's evidence out there that supports that it could serve as somewhat of a limiting factor in the spread of the disease. And with the wolf population in northern Wisconsin, I mean, there's hardly any CWD in northern Wisconsin, but there's a fairly healthy wolf population, and I think that there's evidence from research out in Colorado that's looking at mountain lions and their choices that they make in their predation, and how it seems like they're preying more on CWD affected animals, despite not showing any signs of having the disease, physical signs. So there's, I think there's a lot going there, and it's definitely a concern of the tribes with the, the proposed delisting of the wolf in the states, especially with some of the mismanagement that took place when they were delisted a few years back. There's just a lot of concerns about the impacts on the wolf population and other predator populations, especially when it seems like they might serve as somewhat of a limiting factor in the spread of the disease, natural spread of the disease on the landscape.
That would be wonderful to get some more research in on that. The last question I asked to the panel, and in going back to what the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Group does, is as people, Mr. Joyce and I work on Asian carp. We've got other invasive species, and people like, I'm not going to go out and go fish. I'm afraid of, transmitting Asian carp through minnow buckets and things like that. People, boating, being worried about transmitting some of the aquatic invasive species, plant species, and that. So I hear this. I live in Minnesota, and people are concerned. They want to do the right thing, and so there isn't as much joy and freedom of movement and excitement about participating in some of these outdoor activities. In the mid-'90s, deer hunters, they were worried about, am I going to get sick if I eat the meat? Butchers won't take it anymore. I don't have any place to dispose of the carcass. What kind of conversations do we need to be having with groups such as yours and the Deer Hunters Association and that to make sure, one, they help us organize, get the research, be part of the research team in many cases, and tribal nations as well, and to keep the spirit alive of hunting, fishing, and gathering, not only in our tribal communities, but in our communities at large?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's something we wrestle with. I mean, I think that, listen, hunters are no different than anybody else. They've been doing things a certain way for a long time. They want to just keep doing things that same way. They have a certain healthy distrust for state government, and so they are very susceptible to the, basically the fake news that, oh, it's always been there, it's not a problem. I've been eating CWD positive meat forever, never hurt me. And I just think that it's that's crazy stuff. So I mean, part of the goal of this National Academy of Science study is to have that gold standard out there on where this disease is, how it spreads, what the threat might be, but also what the future priorities are and what the management actions we need to take are. And honestly, hunters, if they are educated well and they have they know what's going on, the state agencies are partners with them and not perceived as being dictatorial in some fashion, they're going to do the right thing. Because it's in their interest to preserve the traditions. And yeah, okay, they can't use maybe urine scents, they can't bait animals, but fundamentally those are inconveniences. So that's not going to change the culture of hunting. And people getting away for deer camp for that week and being with friends and family and harvesting some animals and eating that together. I mean, those are the things that really make hunting special, and those will continue if we have that great partnership with the state agencies, with the federal agencies and research and oversight. If we basically make sure that the captive deer industry is not, destroying that golden goose of the wild hunting industry to make a few bucks. If we can do all that stuff, I mean, I think that, hunters are going to be part of the solution. It's going to, continue to be very positive. It's not too late at this point. But we need that funding from Congress to help the states do their jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Joyce, I would like you and I to submit some questions to U.S. Fish and Wildlife so we hear from the people right on the ground on some of the issues, problems, and challenges on our wildlife refuges. And I think we need to expand that to BLM and to our national parks as well, so our staffs can work on that together. Do you have any other questions?
No, agreed to the sending those questions out, and I have no further questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony as well as the first panel. And just because sometimes there's misnomers that only certain segments of our population, shall I say, are interested in hunting and fishing. I think even though I usually have a fishing license handy to take out and show people, I don't hunt, but I know it's a
Never too late.
Never too late. I was with my grandfather enough. I think I got my taste of it. But my taste was on the plate of the antelope and the deer that we ate at the dinner table. But I'd like to also thank Dr. Tiffany Wolf for her great research, and I would be remiss if I didn't give another shout out to Jamie Fenbecker and some of the legislators in Minnesota who are trying to raise state awareness on this. So, with no further questions, the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you. So we can wrap these up. You got good stuff here.
Great testimony. Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
You guys too.
Thank you.
So let us know if we